I'm Nora, 34, sitting alone in my mother-in-law Margaret's empty house after her funeral. For 8 years, our relationship was complicated, filled with tension and disapproval. My husband Eric couldn't attend his own mother's funeral, stranded overseas on business when her unexpected stroke took her at 62. Now in her immaculate study, I've found an envelope with my name written in her elegant handwriting. What's inside will change everything I thought I knew. Before I share what was inside that envelope, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had a complicated relationship with an in-law. Your comments mean the world to me. I first met Eric during my junior year at Northwestern University in Chicago. I'd grown up in a small town in Oregon called Maplewood, raised primarily by my hardworking single mother after my parents divorced when I was 7. Mum had sacrificed everything to make sure I could get a good education. I was the first person in my family to go to college studying journalism, with dreams of writing stories that would make a difference. Eric was in the business program, tall, with thoughtful brown eyes and a smile that made my heart skip. We met at a campus coffee shop when we both reached for the last blueberry muffin. He insisted I take it, then asked if he could join me. By the end of that conversation, I knew there was something special between us. He was ambitious, but kind, driven, but not ruthless, like many of the other business majors I'd met. Our relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, we had moved in together in a tiny apartment near campus. Eric came from a wealthy Boston family, but he never made me feel less than because of my more humble background. At least he didn't. His mother was a different story. I met Margaret Harrington for the first time about 8 months into our relationship. Eric had spoken of her often. His father had passed away when Eric was in high school, and he and his mother had grown especially close afterward. She had never remarried, focusing instead on charity work, and according to Eric, keeping tabs on her only son. "She's going to love you," Eric assured me as we dressed for dinner at an upscale Boston restaurant during our visit. Just be yourself. I'd spent hours choosing my outfit. A navy blue dress that was the most expensive thing I owned, bought specially for this meeting. I wanted to make a good impression. This was the woman who had raised the man I was falling in love with. From the moment Margaret swept into the restaurant 15 minutes late, I felt the weight of her assessment. She was immaculately dressed in a cream-coloured pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, her silver-streaked dark hair cut in a precise bob. She kissed Eric on both cheeks, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So this is the journalist," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Not Nora, or the girl you've been telling me about. Just the journalist." As if my career choice was some sort of curiosity. The dinner that followed was an exercise in subtle undermining. Margaret asked about my family, then responded with a tight smile when I mentioned my mother was a dental receptionist. "And your father?" she asked, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "He lives in California now. He's a contractor," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. I didn't mention that I hadn't seen him in 3 years. Was her only response, somehow packing volumes of judgment into a single syllable. Throughout the meal, she peppered me with questions about my studies, my career ambitions, where I saw myself in 5 years. With each answer, I watched her mentally check boxes, finding me wanting in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. "Journalism is such a passionate field," she said at one point, the slight pause making it clear this wasn't a compliment. "Though I worry about the stability. So many newspapers going digital now, aren't they, cutting staff?" "Actually, Mom, Nora's already had internships at the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe," Eric interjected. "Her professors say she's incredibly talented." Margaret smiled thinly. "How nice. I just want what's best for you, darling, both of you." As we left the restaurant, Eric squeezed my hand. "See? That went well." I was stunned. If that was well in Eric's mind, I couldn't imagine what a bad meeting would look like. When I tentatively voiced my concerns on the way back to our hotel, he brushed them off. "That's just Mom's way, but," he said. "She's protective of me. She'll warm up once she gets to know you better." But she didn't warm up. Over the next 2 years, as Eric and I finished college and moved to Chicago to start our careers, Margaret remained coolly civil during our visits to Boston and her occasional trips to see us. She never openly criticized me, but her disapproval hung in the air like a persistent chill. When Eric proposed on our 2-year anniversary, I was ecstatic. He hadn't told Margaret of his plans beforehand, which I took as a small victory. We called her together to share the news. "Well," she said after a moment of silence, "this is certainly sudden. We've been together for 2 years, Mum." Eric set his arm around me as we sat on our couch phone on speaker. Yes, but you're both so young, just starting your careers. She paused. I suppose congratulations are in order. Have you set a date? Not yet, I said, trying to maintain my happiness despite her dampening effect. We're thinking maybe next summer. Summer weddings are so predictable, she responded. And hot. You might consider fall instead. The Harringtons have always had fall weddings. It was the first of many not-so-subtle attempts to shape our wedding into what she wanted rather than what we did. And unfortunately, it was just the beginning of my complicated relationship with Margaret Harrington. The engagement marked the beginning of what I now call the Margaret Marathon, an endurance test of wedding planning where every decision became a battleground. She had opinions on everything: the venue, the Boston Harbor Hotel, where Harringtons always had their special events, the guest list, heavy on Boston society names, light on my family and friends, even the flowers, no lilies. They reminded her of funerals, despite being my favorite. Eric tried to mediate, but his default position was usually, maybe Mom has a point. I compromised more than I should have, justifying it as respect for his family traditions. But when she tried to change our wedding colours from blue and silver to cream and gold without consulting me, I finally put my foot down. It's our wedding, not just hers, I told Eric during a tense conversation in our apartment. I've been flexible on almost everything else, but this matters to me. She's just trying to help, he said, his standard response. She's planned dozens of events like this. But this isn't just any event. It's our wedding day. After much discussion, Eric reluctantly agreed to talk to his mother. I wasn't present for the conversation, but whatever he said must have registered somewhat, because Margaret backed off, at least on the colours. The week before the wedding, we flew to Boston for final preparations. I'd asked my mother to come early too, hoping that maybe the two mothers could bond over wedding details. It was a naive hope. Margaret treated my mother with the same polite distance she showed me arranging for her to stay at a hotel rather than offering a guest room in her spacious home where Eric and I were staying. It's just easier this way, Margaret explained when I questioned her. Your mother will have her privacy and we're going to be so busy with last-minute arrangements. On our wedding day, I was getting ready with my bridesmaids when my maid of honour, Jenna, came into the room with an odd expression. Your mother-in-law is wearing cream, she said quietly. What? I turned from the mirror where I was having my makeup done. A cream-coloured dress, almost white. It was a small thing perhaps, but it felt deliberate. Another way for Margaret to centre herself at our wedding. I took a deep breath and decided not to let it ruin my day. The ceremony itself was beautiful despite Margaret's subtle attempts at sabotage. She'd changed the processional music at the last minute, claiming there had been a misunderstanding with the string quartet. During the reception, she monopolised Eric for photographs, leaving me to greet guests alone for nearly an hour. When it came time for toasts, her speech was all about Eric as a child and how she'd raised such a wonderful son with barely a mention of me or our relationship. My mother noticed. Is she always like this? She asked me quietly as we watched Margaret holding court at a table of her friends. Pretty much, I admitted. Eric doesn't see it. Mum squeezed my hand. Just remember who he chose to marry, she said. You, not her. I clung to that thought during the early years of our marriage, as Margaret's interference continued. She called Eric daily sometimes, while we were having dinner or even in bed. She began making surprise visits to Chicago every few months, always expecting to stay in our home rather than a hotel. She criticised everything from how I organised the kitchen to the way I folded Eric's shirts. Eric likes his collars pressed this way, she would say, redoing my work. Or, the Harrington silver is actually stored with anti-tarnish strips between each piece as she reorganised our wedding gifts. I tried establishing boundaries. We love having you visit, Margaret, but maybe next time we could have a little advance notice. This was met with wounded looks and comments to Eric about feeling unwelcome in my only son's home. Eric constantly found himself caught between us. To his credit, he occasionally stood up for me, asking his mother to call before visiting, for instance. But more often, he tried to keep the peace by giving in to her demands. It's just easier this way, he would say, echoing her words. Our first major argument about Margaret came when we bought our first house, a charming 3-bedroom in a leafy Chicago suburb. We were so proud of this milestone achieved through years of saving and hard work. Margaret flew in to help us settle, which apparently meant critiquing every choice we'd made. Hardwood would have been better than this carpeting, she noted in the living room. And these kitchen cabinets. They're not real wood, are they? The final straw came when she rearranged our bedroom furniture while I was at work. I came home to find our carefully positioned bed moved to the opposite wall and a chair I loved relegated to the guest room. The feng shui is much better this way, she explained, and that chair was throwing off the whole aesthetic. That night after she'd gone to bed in our guest room, I confronted Eric. This has to stop, I said, keeping my voice low. She can't just come into our home and take over. She's trying to help, he replied the familiar refrain. No, she's trying to control. There's a difference? I was fighting back tears of frustration. Do you know how it feels to have every choice I make second-guessed, assumed, to be made to feel like an intruder in my own marriage? You're overreacting, Eric said, but I could see doubt in his eyes. Mum just has strong opinions. And your opinion? Do you have one that isn't just echoing hers? The words came out harsher than I intended. He looked stung. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you chose my feelings over hers? When was the last time you saw how her behaviour affects me? That argument ended without resolution, like so many others about Margaret. But it marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the next few years of our marriage. Me growing increasingly frustrated by Margaret's interference, Eric caught in the middle, and a rift slowly widening between us. By our third year of marriage, my career as a journalist was gaining momentum. I'd moved from general assignment reporting at a local paper to investigative journalism at Chicago's largest daily. My series on corruption in city housing contracts had won a regional award, and I was building a reputation for thorough, insightful reporting. Margaret's response to my career success was predictably underwhelming. "How nice that your little stories are getting attention," she said during one phone call, "though I do worry about the hours you're keeping. Eric mentioned you were out past midnight for that homeless shelter piece. That can't be good for your marriage." What she didn't say directly but implied constantly was that my career focus was the reason Eric and I hadn't yet provided her with grandchildren. In reality, we had been trying for over a year with 2 early miscarriages that devastated us, but that we kept private. The fertility specialist suggested stress might be a contributing factor, which added another layer of complexity to my already strained relationship with Margaret. "When are you two going to start a family?" she would ask during almost every visit. "Eric would make such a wonderful father, and I'm not getting any younger, you know." Each time I would feel a stab of guilt and inadequacy, while Eric would mumble something about "when the time is right." He never told his mother about our struggles, despite my suggestion that it might make her more sensitive. "She'll just worry," he said, "or offer to pay for treatments, and then she'll feel entitled to be involved in every decision." He wasn't wrong about that. Margaret's financial generosity always came with strings attached. When she offered to contribute to our house down payment, it came with opinions on which neighbourhoods were acceptable. When she gave us a substantial cheque for our first anniversary, it was accompanied by suggestions for investment opportunities her financial advisor had identified. Eric's work as a management consultant meant frequent travel, leaving me to deal with Margaret alone more often than I liked. During one of his longer assignments in Los Angeles, she decided to come stay with me to keep you company. For 2 weeks, I endured daily commentary on everything from my work schedule to my grocery choices. Frozen vegetables. Nora, really, I always prepared fresh for Eric. It makes such a difference in the nutritional value. I bit my tongue so often I'm surprised it didn't develop calluses. Christmas that year brought another hurtful episode. Margaret hosted at her Boston home, as she did every year. She gave Eric an expensive watch, her sister a cashmere sweater, and her brother-in-law golf clubs. My gift was a subscription to a women's magazine focused on home and family. "I thought you might find some useful articles," she said with that thin smile. "There's a wonderful series coming up on balancing career and family. Something to think about." The implication was clear. My priorities were wrong. I should be focusing on giving her grandchildren, not building my career. The breaking point came during a family gathering for Margaret's 60th birthday. Eric had organised a dinner at her favourite restaurant with extended family and her closest friends in attendance. I'd helped with arrangements, even creating a beautiful photo montage of her life that played on screens throughout the evening. During dinner, someone asked about my recent work. I mentioned briefly that I was working on a series about the opioid crisis in suburban communities. "Oh, Nora and her depressing stories," Margaret interjected with a laugh that held no humour. "I keep telling her no one wants to read about such unpleasant things over breakfast. but she insists on digging up trouble instead of focusing on more important things, like family. The table fell awkwardly silent. I waited for Eric to say something, to defend my work or at least acknowledge its importance. But he just studied his plate, then changed the subject to ask his uncle about a recent golf tournament. That night in our hotel room, I couldn't hold back anymore. "You let her dismiss my entire career, and you said nothing," I said, pacing the room while Eric sat on the edge of the bed. "Do you have any idea how that felt? She didn't mean it that way." He started, but I cut him off. "Stop. Please stop making excuses for her. She absolutely meant it that way, and you know it. This has been happening for years, Eric. Years of subtle digs, passive-aggressive comments, and outright criticism, and you just let it happen. What am I supposed to do?" he asked, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "She's my mother, and I'm your wife." My voice broke. "I'm your wife, and I've been trying so hard to make this work to be respectful of your relationship with her while maintaining some dignity of my own. But I can't do it alone anymore." We talked, really talked, late into the night. For the first time, Eric truly seemed to hear me. I explained how Margaret's constant criticism had chipped away at my self-confidence, how her interference had created a wedge between us, how I felt like I was always competing for his loyalty. "I feel like I'm failing at everything," I admitted, tears flowing freely now. "Failing at my marriage because I won't just give in to her. Failing as a woman because I can't give you a child. Failing at setting boundaries because I'm so afraid of coming between you and your mother." Eric looked stricken. "I had no idea you felt this way," he said, taking my hands. I guess I thought you were stronger than that her comments just rolled off you." "Nobody's that strong," I said. "Not when it's constant. Not when it comes from family." That conversation marked a turning point. Eric agreed to start couples therapy, where we began working through the complex dynamics of our marriage and his relationship with his mother. Slowly, he began to recognize the unhealthy patterns that had been established long before I entered the picture. How Margaret had transferred all her emotional needs to Eric after his father's death. How she had subtly trained him to prioritize her feelings above all else. "It's like I've been wearing blinders," he said during one therapy session. "I didn't want to see it because then I'd have to do something about it." With our therapist's guidance, Eric started setting firmer boundaries with Margaret. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't an overnight change, but it was a start. And for the first time in our marriage, I felt like we were truly partners, facing the challenge together instead of me standing alone. The new boundaries with Margaret led to a period of estrangement that was difficult for everyone. When Eric first told her that her unannounced visits needed to stop and that her comments about my career and our family planning were no longer acceptable, she reacted with hurt and indignation. "After everything I've done for you," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "this is how you repay me, by turning against your own mother." "I'm not turning against you, Mom," Eric explained patiently. "I'm asking for respect, for my wife, my marriage, and the boundaries we've set as adults." "She's turned you against me," Margaret insisted. "You were never like this before her." For several months after that conversation, Margaret communicated with Eric only through brief formal texts and occasional stilted phone calls. She declined our invitations for visits, sent birthday cards without personal messages, and made it clear she felt deeply wounded by the new dynamic. Eric struggled with the estrangement more than he let on. I would sometimes find him staring at old family photos or checking his phone for messages that didn't come. Despite everything, he loved his mother and felt guilty for causing her pain. "Am I doing the right thing?" But he asked me late one night. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too harsh." "You're asking for basic respect," I reminded him. "That's not harsh, it's healthy." Then came Margaret's health scare. 9 months into our new normal, Eric received a call from his aunt. Margaret had experienced chest pains and had been admitted to the hospital. Initial tests suggested a minor heart attack. Despite everything, we immediately flew to Boston. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, Margaret was family and she was alone, except for her sister and brother-in-law. I still remember the look of surprise on Margaret's face when we both walked into her hospital room. She had clearly expected Eric, but not me. "You came?" she said simply, looking pale against the white hospital sheets. "Of course we did," Eric replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she admitted, "but better now that you're here." Her gaze shifted to me, standing slightly behind Eric. There was a moment of awkward silence before she added, "Both of you." That hospital visit marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Margaret was advised to make significant lifestyle changes. More rest, less stress, a heart-healthy diet. Eric and I extended our stay in Boston to help her transition home and get settled with her new routine. To my surprise, Margaret accepted my help with unexpected grace. I reorganized her kitchen to make healthy meal preparation easier, researched and interviewed home health aides to check in on her regularly, and set up a medication management system to ensure she stayed on track with her new prescriptions. "You're good at this," she commented one afternoon as I arranged her pills in a weekly organizer. "Very efficient." Coming from Margaret, this was high praise indeed. During those weeks in Boston, I caught glimpses of a different Margaret, one who was vulnerable, sometimes frightened, and occasionally even grateful. Without the usual social facades and power dynamics, we found small moments of genuine connection. She showed me her garden, pointing out plants she had nurtured for decades. I helped her sort through old photographs, listening as she shared stories of Eric as a child. One evening, while Eric was out picking up dinner, Margaret mentioned an article of mine she had read. "The one about the family separated at the border," she said. "It was quite moving. I was stunned." "You read my work?" "Sometimes," she admitted, looking almost embarrassed. "Your name appears in my news alerts." This casual revelation led to one of the most surreal discoveries of my relationship with Margaret. While searching for a particular medication in her study, I opened the wrong drawer and found a carefully maintained folder containing newspaper clippings of my articles. Dozens of them, dating back to my earliest pieces as a staff writer. I didn't mention the discovery to Margaret or Eric, unsure what to make of it. Was she monitoring my work to find fault, or was there something else going on? Some grudging respect or interest she couldn't bring herself to express directly. As Margaret's health improved, we settled into a new rhythm. Sunday phone calls that were civil, sometimes even pleasant. Occasional weekend visits that didn't leave me emotionally drained. Margaret still had her moments. Subtle digs about our continued childlessness, or comments about how Eric was working too hard, the implication being that I should be doing more to support him, but they were fewer and less pointed. For a brief period, I allowed myself to hope that we had turned a corner, that Margaret's health scare had given her perspective and softened her attitude toward me. Then came the dinner where she reverted completely to her old self. We had been in Boston for the weekend celebrating her successful 6-month post-heart attack checkup. Everything had been going well until she mentioned a friend's daughter who had just had a baby. "She put her career on hold, of course," Margaret said, looking pointedly at me. "Some things are more important than work after all." The familiar sting of her judgment brought me right back to where we'd started. Eric noticed my expression and, to his credit, stepped in immediately. "Mom, we've talked about this. Our family planning is our business, not yours." Margaret looked genuinely surprised, as if she'd forgotten our previous conversations completely. "I'm just making conversation," she said defensively. "I think I'm allowed to talk about babies with my own son and daughter-in-law. Not when you're using it to criticize Nora's career choices," Eric said firmly. What followed was our first real argument with Margaret since establishing boundaries. She accused us of overreacting, of being too sensitive. Eric stood his ground in a way I'd rarely seen, reminding her of the boundaries we'd set and the reasons for them. "If you can't respect these boundaries," he said finally, "then we need to rethink how often we visit." It was the first time he had explicitly threatened consequences for her behaviour. Margaret's face registered shock, then hurt, then a cold anger I recognised all too well. "I see," she said stiffly. "Well, if that's how you feel, perhaps it's best if you leave now instead of staying the night as planned." We did leave, checking into a hotel and flying back to Chicago the next morning. The ride to the airport was silent, both of us processing what had happened. "I'm sorry," Eric said finally as we waited at our gate. "I really thought she was changing." "Maybe change isn't linear," I suggested. "Maybe there will be backsliding and progress mixed together." He nodded, looking tired. "I just wish it wasn't so hard." The truth was, I wished that too. Despite everything, I didn't want to be the reason for conflict between Eric and his mother. I didn't enjoy the tension or the constant vigilance required to maintain boundaries. But I also knew we couldn't go back to the way things had been before. The subtle undermining the competition for Eric's loyalty, the slow erosion of my self-worth. What I didn't know then was that our complicated relationship with Margaret was about to take a turn none of us could have anticipated. 6 months after our confrontation in Boston, Eric was preparing for an important business trip to Japan. As a senior consultant, He was leading a team working with a major automotive manufacturer on streamlining their supply chain. The 2-week trip had been planned for months and couldn't be rescheduled without significant professional consequences. The night before his departure, Margaret called. Not Eric's phone, but mine. Something that had happened only a handful of times in our entire relationship. "Nora?" she said when I answered, her voice sounding strained. "Is Eric there?" "He's packing," I replied, glancing toward our bedroom where Eric was organizing his suitcase. "Do you want me to get him?" No, she said quickly. "I don't want to disturb him before his trip. I have this terrible headache. It started yesterday and won't go away. I've taken medication, but it's not helping." The complaint itself wasn't unusual. Margaret often shared minor health issues with Eric, usually as a way of garnering attention. But the fact that she was telling me set off alarm bells. "Have you called your doctor?" I asked. "I left a message," she said. "But you know how they are. It could be days before they call back. A persistent headache that doesn't respond to medication should be checked out." I said, my concern growing, "Especially with your heart history. Maybe you should go to urgent care." "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," Margaret replied, though she sounded less certain than her words suggested. "I just wanted Eric to know I might not be able to take his calls for a day or two if this continues. I can barely look at screens with this pain." After the call, I relayed the conversation to Eric. He frowned, concerned but not alarmed. "She gets migraines sometimes," he said. "They usually pass in a day or two. I'll check in with her before I leave for the airport tomorrow." He did call her the next morning, but there was no answer. "She's probably resting," he reasoned as I drove him to the airport. "I'll try again when I land in Tokyo." Something didn't feel right to me. Margaret always answered Eric's calls no matter the time or circumstance. After dropping Eric at the departure terminal, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of driving home, I headed to the interstate toward Boston. The 5-hour drive gave me plenty of time to second-guess myself. Was I overreacting? Probably. Would Margaret be annoyed to find me on her doorstep? Almost certainly. But something in her voice during our call had triggered a deep concern I couldn't shake. I arrived at Margaret's colonial-style home in Cambridge just after 3 p.m. The house looked quiet, curtains drawn despite the pleasant spring afternoon. I rang the doorbell several times with no response, then tried calling her phone, hearing it ring inside the house. My anxiety mounting, I used the spare key Eric had given me years ago for emergencies. The house was silent and felt unusually cold, as if the air conditioning had been set too low. "Margaret!" I called, moving through the formal living room toward the kitchen. "It's Nora. Are you here?" A faint sound from upstairs made me freeze. It might have been a moan or a whimper, barely audible, but definitely human. I took the stairs 2 at a time, calling Margaret's name with increasing urgency. The master bedroom was empty bed neatly made. The guest room too was undisturbed. Then I noticed light under the bathroom door. "Margaret?" "I'm coming in," I announced, knocking briefly before turning the handle. I found her on the bathroom floor, conscious, but barely responsive, her elegant silver-streaked hair damp with sweat, her complexion ashen. Her eyes found mine filled with confusion and fear. "Nora," she whispered, "what are you—" "Don't try to talk," I said, already pulling out my phone to call 911. "I'm getting help." The next hours passed in a blur of emergency responders, ambulance sirens, and hospital corridors. The preliminary diagnosis was a massive stroke, with Margaret's condition critical but stable. I called Eric repeatedly, but with the time difference and his flight, I couldn't reach him. I left urgent messages asking him to call as soon as he landed. Then began the longest night of my life. Sitting in the ICU waiting room occasionally permitted brief visits to Margaret's bedside, trying desperately to reach Eric or anyone else in Margaret's family. Her sister was on a cruise in Alaska, unreachable for at least another day. Friends were notified, but most lived hours away. I was alone with the woman who had made me feel like an outsider for 8 years, now making critical medical decisions as her next of kin by marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. The doctors were guardedly pessimistic. The stroke had been severe, affecting a large area of brain tissue. Margaret was stabilized, but unresponsive machines breathing for her, monitoring every vital function. "The next 24 to 48 hours are critical," the neurologist explained gently. "If she survives, there will likely be significant impairment. You should prepare yourself for difficult decisions ahead." I nodded numbly, trying to absorb what he was saying, while part of my mind was still frantically calculating when Eric would land in Tokyo, when he would get my messages, how quickly he could possibly return. Late that night, a nurse allowed me an extended visit at Margaret's bedside. The usually formidable woman looked small and fragile among the tubes and monitors. I sat beside her, uncertain what to do or say, but unwilling to leave her alone. I've reached out to Eric. I told her, not knowing if she could hear me. He'll come as soon as he can. Your sister too. You're not alone, Margaret. I found myself talking to fill the silence, telling her about the book I was reading, about a funny incident at work the previous week, about the spring flowers blooming in our Chicago garden. Anything to create a sense of normalcy in this surreal situation. Around 2 a.m., something changed. An alarm beeped and a nurse rushed in to check Margaret's vitals. She adjusted something on one of the machines, then looked at me with sympathy. Her blood pressure is dropping, she explained quietly. The doctor is on his way. What followed was a flurry of medical intervention as the team worked to stabilize Margaret. I was asked to step outside during the most intense moments, standing in the hallway with my arms wrapped around myself, praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. When I was finally allowed back in, the doctor took me aside. "We've stabilized her for now," he said, his expression grave. "But I need to be honest with you. The damage is extensive. We're not seeing the kind of neurological responses we would hope for at this stage. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that she might not recover." I nodded, unable to form words. The weight of the situation, making these decisions alone without Eric or any other family member, felt crushing. Later, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside the hospital windows, something unexpected happened. During one of my permitted visits to Margaret's bedside, her eyes flooded open. Not the blank stare of unconsciousness, but a moment of true awareness, her gaze finding and focusing on mine. "Margaret," I said, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved, though no sound came out. Her right hand twitched on the blanket, and instinctively I took it in mine. Her fingers closed weakly around mine. A deliberate gesture. She seemed to be trying to speak, her face contorting with effort. I leaned closer, trying to understand. What I heard, or thought I heard, was barely a whisper. "Letter. My desk." Then her eyes closed again, her hand went limp in mine, and the monitors began to alarm. The medical team rushed in, working frantically, but this time their efforts were in vain. Margaret Harrington passed away at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in early April, with only her daughter-in-law, the woman she had kept at arm's length for 8 years, at her side. I finally reached Eric 3 hours later when his plane landed in Tokyo. Telling him his mother had died while he was 30,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean was one of the hardest things I've ever done. His grief, shock, and guilt transmitted clearly even across thousands of miles. "I'm coming home," he said immediately. "I'll get the first flight out." But a severe weather system over the Pacific had grounded all departing flights from Tokyo. It would be 36 hours before Eric could get on a plane, and another 14 hours of travel after that. I would handle the immediate aftermath of Margaret's death. The paperwork, the funeral home, the initial arrangements, alone. As I drove from the hospital to Margaret's house that afternoon, her whispered words echoed in my mind. "Letter. My desk." Was it just the random firing of neurons in a dying brain, or had she been trying to tell me something important? There was only one way to find out. The funeral was small and subdued, held at the Episcopal church Margaret had attended for decades. Most of the attendees were her friends and colleagues from the various charitable boards she had served on. They viewed me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The daughter-in-law they had heard about but rarely met, now somehow in charge of arrangements. I overheard whispers, "Where's Eric? Couldn't he make it to his own mother's funeral?" And she was alone when she passed. How dreadful. I ignored them as best I could, focusing on honouring Margaret's memory as respectfully as possible, based on what Eric had told me she would want. Eric finally arrived the day after the funeral, exhausted and grief-stricken. Our reunion at the airport was a collision of emotions. Relief at being together again, shared grief, and the strange disconnection that comes from having experienced such different versions of the same tragedy. "I should have been here," he said again and again as we drove to Margaret's house, where we would be staying while handling her affairs. "She shouldn't have been alone." "She wasn't alone," I reminded him gently. "I was with her." "Katesan?" He nodded, but I could see the guilt eating at him. If I had postponed the trip, if I had checked on her myself before leaving. "You couldn't have known," I said. "The doctors said it was sudden and severe. Even if you'd been here from the beginning, the outcome would likely have been the same. But logical reassurances couldn't ease the fundamental human need to believe we could have prevented tragedy if we'd just done something differently. I understood that need all too well. The days that followed were filled with practical matters. Meeting with Margaret's attorney, beginning the process of probate, acknowledging condolence cards and calls. Eric moved through these tasks like a man underwater, present but not fully engaged. At night, I would often find him sitting in his mother's study looking through old photo albums or just staring into space. The emotional distance between us grew, not from lack of love or caring, but from our different experiences of Margaret's death and our different ways of processing grief. Eric seemed to be idealizing his mother in death in a way he never had in life, speaking of her with a reverence that glossed over the complexities of their relationship, and especially her treatment of me. I didn't challenge this. Grief needed its own time and space, and criticizing the dead felt petty and cruel, but it left me feeling increasingly isolated, carrying the memory of those final moments with Margaret that Eric would never share. About 2 weeks after the funeral, we began the overwhelming task of sorting through Margaret's belongings. Her house was immaculately kept but full. Closets of designer clothes, cabinets of fine china, shelves of books and collectibles gathered over a lifetime. "We should donate most of it," Eric said as we surveyed the contents of her bedroom. Mum would have wanted her things to be useful to someone. I agreed, and we developed a system. Items of sentimental value to keep, valuable pieces to potentially sell, everyday items to donate. The process was both physically and emotionally exhausting, each object carrying memories and associations. In Margaret's study, we found unexpected glimpses into her life. A drawer of handwritten recipes, including some labelled Eric's favourites in her elegant script. A collection of theatre programs dating back decades. A file of letters from her late husband Richard, written during business trips in the early years of their marriage. "I never knew Dad wrote to her like this," Eric said, reading one with wonder. "They always seemed so formal with each other, at least in front of me." Then we discovered a locked drawer in her desk. The small brass key wasn't among her regular keys, and we might have put off opening it if I hadn't remembered her final words. "Let me check something," I said, moving to the bookshelf that occupied one wall of the study. Margaret's books were organised by subject and author, a system I'd noticed years before. I scanned the poetry section until I found what I was looking for, a volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's works. During one of our rare civil conversations years earlier, I had mentioned that Sonnets from the Portuguese had been my mother's favourite poems to read to me as a child. Margaret had seemed dismissive at the time, but here was the book on her shelf. I opened it, and there, used as a bookmark, was a small brass key. Eric watched with confusion as I returned to the desk and tried the key in the locked drawer. It turned smoothly, and the drawer slid open. Inside was a single envelope, cream-coloured and expensive, with "For Nora, to be opened after I'm gone," written on the front in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. "What is that?" Eric asked, coming to look over my shoulder. "I don't know," I admitted, "but your mother's last words to me. I think she was telling me about this." I held the envelope, feeling its weight. Part of me was afraid to open it, afraid of one final criticism from beyond the grave, one last attempt to assert control or express disapproval. Eric seemed equally uncertain. "Do you want to open it now, or—" "Not yet," I decided. "Let's finish what we're doing here first." I tucked the envelope into my purse, and we continued sorting through Margaret's belongings. But my mind kept returning to it, wondering what final message my mother-in-law had left specifically for me. Not for Eric, not for both of us, but for me alone. That night, after Eric had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, I sat in the kitchen of Margaret's house, soon to be sold, the proceeds divided according to her will, and held the envelope in my hands. Whatever it contained, I realised I wanted to experience it alone first, without having to manage Eric's reaction alongside my own. With a deep breath, I carefully opened the seal and removed several sheets of Margaret's personal stationery, covered front and back with her handwriting. The letter was dated just 2 months earlier, after her heart attack, but before her stroke. "Dear Nora," it began, and as I read further, the floor seemed to drop away beneath me. My hands trembled as I read Margaret's elegant handwriting spreading across the pages. The letter began formally, almost stiffly, as if she had struggled with how to address me even in writing. "Dear Nora, if you're reading this, I am gone, and there are things I need to say that I couldn't bring myself to express while I was living. Things you deserve to know, though the knowledge comes too late for any real reconciliation between us. First, I must confess something that may shock you. My treatment of you over the years was never about you at all. It was about me, my fears, my jealousy, and my inability to break free from patterns established long before you entered our lives. When you first came into Eric's life, I saw everything I had never been able to be. You were independent, outspoken, talented in your own right. You had built a life on your own terms without compromising your identity or ambitions for anyone. I envied that more than you can possibly understand. I stopped reading for a moment, stunned by this admission. Margaret had envied me. The woman who had made me feel inadequate at every turn had actually been jealous of me. It seemed impossible to reconcile with the Margaret I thought I knew. I continued reading, my confusion growing. My marriage to Richard, Eric's father, was not the partnership you and Eric have forged. Richard was brilliant and ambitious, but also controlling and emotionally distant. He had clear expectations for his wife, to maintain a perfect home, to support his career, to represent the family well in social circles, and above all, never to challenge him publicly. I came from a generation and background where this was simply accepted as a woman's role. I sublimated my own interests and ambitions to become the wife Richard wanted. When he died, I realized I had spent 25 years becoming someone I barely recognized, with no clear sense of who I might have been otherwise. By then, Eric was my whole world. Not in a healthy way I now understand, but in the desperate way of a woman who had nothing else to claim as her own achievement. My identity had become so wrapped up in being Eric's mother, sir, that the thought of sharing him, of no longer being the primary woman in his life, was terrifying. The letter continued, describing how Margaret had transferred all her unfulfilled hopes and expectations onto Eric, burdening him with the responsibility for her happiness in ways neither of them fully recognized. When he met you, she wrote, I saw the immediate threat to the careful world I had constructed, not because you were unkind or wrong for him. Quite the opposite. You were exactly what he needed, but your strength highlighted my weakness. Your independence threatened the dependence I had cultivated. Your honest expressions of opinion made my careful deference seem like the surrender it was. And so I did what frightened, insecure people often do. I tried to undermine you, to make you doubt yourself, to create division between you and Eric. It was unconscionable, and I knew it even as I did it, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Tears blurred my vision as I read on. Margaret described specific incidents I remembered all too well: the wedding interference, the critical comments about my career, the exclusionary behaviours. But from her perspective, acknowledging the deliberate nature of some actions, I had always tried to explain away as misunderstandings. The cruel irony, she continued, is that over time I developed a grudging respect for you that eventually grew into genuine admiration. Your refusal to be cowed by my behaviour, your persistence in building a meaningful career the way you loved my son without trying to change him, these qualities impressed me deeply, though I could never bring myself to tell you so. I began following your work, saving your articles proud in a way I couldn't acknowledge even to myself. The piece you wrote about the refugee family last year moved me to tears, not just for its content, but for the evident compassion and integrity behind it. You have gifts I never allowed myself to develop, courage I never found. I had to stop reading again, overwhelmed by these revelations. I remembered finding the folder of my articles in Margaret's desk and wondering about its meaning. Now I knew it had been a secret acknowledgement of respect she couldn't bring herself to express directly. The letter took another unexpected turn as Margaret began sharing details about her marriage that I had never known. How Richard had conducted multiple affairs that she had discovered but never confronted him about, how he had controlled their finances completely, leaving her vulnerable and dependent, how she had suffered a severe depression after losing a baby boy at 26 weeks pregnant, a depression Richard had dismissed as feminine hysteria, and insisted she hide from their social circle. My greatest fear for you and Eric, she wrote, was that history would repeat itself, that Eric would become like his father, successful, respected, but emotionally unavailable, that you would find yourself gradually sacrificing pieces of your identity until, like me, you woke up one day not recognizing your own reflection. I saw signs of it happening. Eric's focus on his career at the expense of your relationship, his difficulty standing up to me on your behalf, his avoidance of conflict that mirrors his father so clearly. But instead of helping to prevent this pattern, I enabled and encouraged it. For that I am deeply sorry. More sorry than words can adequately express. The final pages of the letter contained something I never expected. advice from Margaret about how to maintain my authentic self within my marriage, encouragement to continue pursuing my career passions, and a plea to help Eric become the man she believed he could be, free from the patterns of his father and her own damaging influence. Eric is a good man with a kind heart, she wrote, but he has never learned to recognize and defend healthy boundaries. That's my failure as his mother. He needs your strength, Nora. He needs your example of what it means to live authentically, to speak truth even when it's difficult. Don't let him retreat into the comfortable avoidance that defined his father's life, and too often my relationship with both of you. I don't expect or deserve your forgiveness for the pain I've caused. But I hope this explanation might offer some small peace, some understanding that my behavior reflected my own brokenness rather than any actual inadequacy on your part. You are and have always been more than enough, something I was too insecure to acknowledge while I lived. The letter concluded with a postscript that left me gasping. P.S. I have established a scholarship fund in your name at Northwestern University for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds pursuing degrees in journalism. It seems a fitting legacy, supporting others with your passion and determination who might otherwise be overlooked as I overlooked your worth for too long. The details are with my attorney who will contact you. This doesn't begin to make amends, but perhaps it will help some small good come from our difficult history. I sat at Margaret's kitchen table until dawn broke, reading and rereading the letter, trying to reconcile this vulnerable, regretful woman with the formidable, critical mother-in-law I had known for 8 years. Both were real. Both were Margaret. The complexity of it, the missed opportunities for understanding the wasted years of antagonism based on fear and insecurity rather than actual dislike, felt overwhelming. When Eric found me there in the morning, red-eyed and exhausted, the letter spread out before me. I couldn't find words to explain what I had discovered. Instead, I simply handed him the pages and watched as he read his mother's final confession. Eric read the letter slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, pain, and finally a profound sadness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. When he finished, he carefully placed the pages down and sat in silence for several long moments. I had no idea, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, about any of this. Dad's affairs, the baby they lost, how controlled she felt. It's like she was a completely different person than the mother I thought I knew. People are complex, I said gently. We only see the parts of them they allow us to see. But I'm her son, he replied, looking lost. Shouldn't I have known? Shouldn't I have seen beneath the surface? She worked very hard to protect you from these truths, I pointed out. It seems like she spent her whole life crafting a specific image for you, of herself, of your father, of their marriage. That wasn't your failure, it was her choice. Eric picked up the letter again, rereading portions with a furrowed brow. The way she writes about Dad, I always thought they had this perfect marriage. He was my hero growing up. People can be good fathers and flawed husbands, I suggested. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He nodded absently, still processing. And what she writes about me, about seeing him in me. His voice trailed off, and I could see the painful self-examination beginning. Is she right? He asked after a moment, looking up at me with vulnerable eyes. Am I like him in those ways? Do I avoid conflict the way she describes? Have I failed to stand up for you the way I should have? This was dangerous territory. In his raw state of grief, my complete honesty might be more harmful than helpful. But Margaret's letter had laid bare so many unspoken truths already. It seemed wrong to add another layer of pretense. Yes, I said gently. In some ways you have been conflict avoidant, especially with your mother. And yes, there have been times I wished you had defended me more strongly against her criticism. We've talked about this in therapy. He winced but didn't argue, and her fears about our marriage, about you losing yourself the way she did. I considered this carefully. I don't think that's happened, I said finally. I've maintained my identity and my career more successfully than she did. But there have been compromises, adjustments. That's part of any marriage. But healthy compromises, he pressed. Or have you been silently sacrificing pieces of yourself to keep the peace the way she did with my father? It was a surprisingly insightful question, one that showed he was truly grappling with the implications of his mother's revelations. A bit of both, probably, I admitted. There are times I've swallowed my feelings to avoid conflict. Times I've adjusted my expectations rather than risk disappointment, but I don't think I've lost myself the way Margaret describes. My career has remained important to me, and you've supported that, even if you didn't always stand up to your mother about it. Eric seemed to absorb this turning pages of the letter again until he found a specific passage. She writes here about her hope that I'll become the man she believes I can be. What do you think she meant by that? I think she saw your potential to be better than your father's example, I said. More emotionally available, more supportive of your partner as an equal. She recognized good qualities in you that she wanted to see fully developed. He was quiet again, contemplative in a way I rarely saw him. The Eric I knew was action-oriented, quick to move on from difficult emotions to practical solutions. This more reflective version was something new, perhaps the beginning of the growth Margaret had hoped for. I need to do better, he said finally. For you, for us, for the family we might still have someday. I reached across the table and took his hand. We can both do better. That's what marriage is. Growing together, learning from our mistakes, building something stronger than what we inherited from our parents. Over the next few days, as we continued sorting through Margaret's belongings and finalising arrangements for her estate, Eric and I had deeper, more honest conversations than we'd managed in years of therapy. Margaret's letter had somehow given us permission to speak difficult truths about his parents' dysfunctional marriage, about patterns he had unconsciously adopted, about my own compromises and resentments. We discovered as Margaret's attorney confirmed that she had indeed established the scholarship fund in my name, a surprisingly generous endowment that would support young women journalists for decades to come. It was a gesture so at odds with the Margaret I thought I knew, that it underscored how little I had understood her complex inner life. The attorney also delivered another surprise, a separate letter addressed to Eric that contained Margaret's final wishes for her remains. She wanted to be cremated with her ashes scattered in a garden at their family's summer home in Maine, a place she had found peace. She rode away from the social pressures and expectations of Boston society. She never told me any of this, Eric said, shaking his head in wonder. We had talked about funeral arrangements after her heart attack, and she insisted on a traditional burial in the family plot. This is completely different. Maybe writing these letters gave her permission to express what she truly wanted, I suggested, without worrying about appearances or expectations. We honoured her wishes, making the trip to Maine the following weekend to scatter her ashes among the wildflowers beginning to bloom along the rocky coastline. The small summer cottage which Eric had inherited held happier memories for him. Summers away from the formality of their Boston life, rare glimpses of his mother relaxed and laughing. She used to read to me on that porch, he told me, pointing to a weathered deck overlooking the ocean. Poetry sometimes, not just children's books. I'd forgotten that until now. As spring turned to summer, we returned to our lives in Chicago, but with subtle shifts in our relationship. Eric began seeing a therapist individually, working through his complicated feelings about his parents and the patterns he wanted to break. I found myself thinking about Margaret differently, not excusing her behaviour toward me, but understanding it with more compassion than I had managed while she was alive. About a year after Margaret's death, I wrote an anonymous article for a national magazine about forgiveness, generational trauma, and the unspoken burdens people carry. I didn't share the specifics of Margaret's letter, but I explored the broader themes: how people often hurt others from their own places of pain, how understanding someone's story can transform anger into compassion, how the courage to be vulnerable might come too late for reconciliation in this life, but can still offer healing to those left behind. The article went viral, generating thousands of comments from readers sharing their own experiences of complicated relationships and posthumous understandings. In a strange way, it felt like honouring Margaret, using my voice, the professional skill she had secretly admired, to help others navigate the messy, complex terrain of family relationships. Eric read it before I submitted it, tears in his eyes as he recognised our story beneath the anonymised details. She would have been proud of this, he said, handing the manuscript back to me, though she might never have told you so. I smiled, thinking of the folder of clippings she had secretly maintained. I think she might have just added it to her collection. On the second anniversary of Margaret's death, Eric and I made a decision that would have shocked her, and perhaps secretly delighted her. After years of fertility struggles and the emotional rollercoaster of treatments, we began the process of adoption. As it happened, our first meeting with the adoption agency fell on what would have been Margaret's 65th birthday. Do you think she knew? Eric asked as we drove home from that meeting, full of nervous excitement about the journey ahead. When she wrote about the family we might still have someday in her letter, do you think she somehow knew we might choose this path? I don't know, I said thoughtfully. But the letter mentioned she volunteered at a women's shelter we never knew about. Maybe she understood more about alternative paths to family than we realized. 6 months later, we welcomed our daughter Lily, a bright-eyed, curious 6-month-old whose birth mother had made the difficult, loving choice to place her with a family better positioned to provide for her future. As I held Lily in the nursery we had prepared, I sometimes found myself thinking of Margaret, wondering what kind of grandmother she might have been if she had lived to meet this child, if she had continued the journey towards self-awareness her letter suggested she had begun. I'll never know the answer to that question, but in an unexpected way, Margaret is still present in our family. Her letter, her final honest communication, changed not just how I understood her, but how Eric and I relate to each other, how we approach parenthood, how we guard against repeating the patterns of the past. When Lily is older, we'll tell her about her grandmother Margaret, not a simplified saint or villain, but a complex woman who struggled, made mistakes, hurt people she loved, but ultimately found the courage to acknowledge her failures and hope for better for those she left behind. We'll show her the scholarship recipients who continue to benefit from Margaret's posthumous generosity, young women pursuing dreams that Margaret herself never felt free to chase. Understanding someone's full story doesn't erase the hurt they caused. Margaret's letter didn't undo the years of criticism and undermining I endured, but it offered context that made forgiveness possible, not for her sake since she was beyond needing it, but for mine. For Eric's. For the family we are building together, free from the weight of resentments we might otherwise have carried forward. Has a letter or message ever completely changed your perspective on someone? Share your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this story touched you, and remember that sometimes the people who are hardest to love are the ones who need it most. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it brings some comfort to those of you navigating your own complicated family relationship.